Hi there, I'm Deep Dylan. Welcome to your AI Injection, the podcast where we discuss state-of-the-art techniques in artificial intelligence with a focus on how these capabilities are used to transform organizations, making them more efficient, impactful, and successful. Welcome to our regular guests, Bill and Carsten. We are going to talk about the viability or lack thereof of using ChatGPT or similar large language models for code generation, but more particularly for like machine learning and AI code assistance, let's call it. So with that, maybe we'll get started. Everybody had their homework assignments to go off and try to do something with ChatGPT. What kind of stuff did you guys try and what did we find?
Well, maybe I'll start off. I wouldn't say I delved into the machine learning space as much as I looked at a problem that was slightly more complicated than, say, a one-liner, something very simple that you could look up on, say, Quora.com or Stack Overflow. And it was actually a real-world problem. My son and I are going to be running a half marathon in a couple months, and the last time we did so, he was a little tyke, and he's grown up much bigger now. And he wanted to know, Dad, how fast would I have to run if I wanted to beat like a 2-hour mark? And that's an incredibly easy calculation, right? If you know the distance and the time that you want to beat, that can tell you your average speed. But we run a little bit differently. We run in intervals of running a little bit and then walking a little bit. So like for a typical marathon, I'll run like 8.5 minutes, say, and then walk 30 seconds. And so that complicates the calculations enough where it's not necessarily a super trivial thing. And actually, I responded to him that when I had run the London Marathon a long time ago, I had actually written some Python code to be able to explore different combinations of run-walk ratios and so forth. And I actually honed in on one during training that I felt comfortable with. So I was going to send him that, but I thought, oh, wouldn't this be a fun experiment to a coding challenge to send to ChatGPT?
Yeah, so what kind of prompt did you use?
Yeah, so I basically described the situation to it tersely as I just described it to you guys. I did give it a heads up on the inputs that I would feed such a function and also the units of that function. And I said, now go ahead and create that function in Python for me. And I pressed the button, and like most people who are interfacing with ChatGPT in the world, a little smile came across my face.
Like, good luck with this.
Well, in a way I was. I mean, I was, it's kind of an esoteric computation given how we're running these intervals. And I didn't really expect it necessarily to logic that out well. But in fact, it did. So actually, let me tell you some things that I thought
didn't though. It didn't though.
Wait. Before we go negative,
all right.
Let's talk about the positive and then talk about the negatives in that order.
Sure. Yeah. So so you kicked it off. It crunched away. What did it spit back?
Yeah. So the first thing that I liked about what it spat back at me was a paragraph describing what the upcoming function was about. So I got a good qualitative description. It gives you a false sense of confidence in a way that it somehow has this forethought and you know what it's doing. I mean, that's also nice in terms of documentation, right? If you were to grab this thing, you can shove that into some comments or something for documentation on that function.
And then it goes ahead and actually gives you the code.
Then it spits out the code. There was actually a couple things that I really liked about the code itself. One was the interim variable names that it came up with on its own were actually very reasonable, like understandable. They weren't super huge in length. They weren't super small in length, like X. And then for some of the code that was, a bit more complex, there was a comment at the end of those lines that described what was actually going on there. And then after that function was spat out, then it gave an example. So it had some input parameters defined, like distance is 26.2, and it had things like walking pace, for example.
I was kind of impressed with its just even its ability to like name variables properly, like reasonably, and to like formulate the problem in a way that at least looked like a sensible formulation, even if it was not correct completely. But
well, that's what's kind of interesting there is like when conservatively, when I actually ran a marathon, I would put these walk pace values about like 18 minutes per mile. It's actually quite slow, but that's very reasonable. And I think it came up with like 20. It seemed like all the values that it came up with were actually also quite reasonable, which was interesting. Oh, I will say too, I forgot to mention that I also said that what I wanted was the average pace of the running segment in minute:second format. And so I saw also in the code that it was able to do so. It took that suggestion to heart and actually did that correctly. What happened though is I was excited. I remember we chatted, I threw this in our chat group. I said, geez, look at this thing. It actually did quite a decent job. But then Carsten pointed out, actually, it's wrong. And he, in fact, was correct in finding out that there was a line in there that was wrong.
So Carsten, what did you find in there? Carsten was much less impressed with the results.
No, I mean, I agree with everything you said so far. It was deceptively good looking.
Yes.
But you totally got catfished because the actual computations, the formulas, they even made sense at first glance. And if you didn't really pay attention to it, and because the output was just numeric and not easily validatable, if you just looked at it, it took me a while to figure out something is wrong with this, right? And ultimately, what I just did like some double checks on the actual computation lines to see simply whether or not the units would match up, right? So if you want, miles per hour, it shouldn't give you miles squared per second. And that is exactly what it did. And at that point, I was like, well, this can't be right? The units don't measure up. That means the calculations must be wrong. Yeah, they were. It would produce code. It would read normally. At first glance, it looks okay. To a detailed control, you realize that what it's computing, the units don't match up. The numeric results are wrong. So I think for me, the lesson learned was great. This is a nice little scaffolding and template. This is kind of like how you should compute this probably, right? But you better damn well check that the actual computations it does are correct and you validate
But
them.
I mean, that sounds like, to me, progress in the sense that I think what you guys are both saying is that this is a reasonable way to not be staring at a blank IDE. And with a little bit of work, you got something else to look at that you can sort of begin modifying and correcting.
If that's what you need, yeah. You could look at something. I like it. Like I had a completely different thing. I was, it's not
Wait. Sorry to interrupt you, but before we leave this particular exercise, there is one thing that I thought was quite impressive and interesting. And that is, and I didn't mention it before, but the final thing that it returned beyond the function was a comment. It said, we assume that the walk pace variable has units. We assume the distance, which is in miles in this case. And if that is not correct, basically fix it, change the code or whatever. And that actually was the problem. And what was kind of interesting is the walk pace given in the example said 20. It had a comment, it said minutes per mile. But then in the code, it used it as miles. So it's almost like it had a lack of confidence, which is making it into a sentient being. But it's almost as if somehow it had a sense of that particular input variable might be problematic in the code, which was kind of interesting. So it's almost like you might want to pay attention to this area. So that was cool for me. But I would agree with Carsten is that you definitely get this false sense of security you can, sort of somewhat simple code snippets like this.
So
you
Carsten,
gotta be careful.
And I think in some cases that doesn't matter, right? So if you have something where you are, I think Deep, you played with something like that, right? You wanted like some CSS layout, right?
Yeah.
I was going to say there's a certain class of problems where correctness is not that important because it's easily validatable and you just want to get an idea how to do that. And previously what you would do is you would just Google for it. How do I stretch a background image in CSS, right? Then you go through your Google pages and you have to figure out examples and you look at a couple, etc., and you find one that works for you, right? And then you try it. And it might work for you or it might not, and then you go to the next one. And with ChatGPT, you can do the same thing, right? Except you don't have to browse through 100 pages and see where on the page the little snippet is that you might use. It just gives you the snippet, and if it's something like that is harmless and you can just validate to see if it works for you, you just use it.
But it gives you a little more than just the snippet. I think the one difference between what you can get with a ChatGPT versus combing Stack Overflow or whatever is, you can actually get it to address the particulars of your problem.
It's like ultra customizable templates.
Yeah, and I find that to be quite powerful. Like, so the example, for the sake of our listeners, I had some basic HTML layout that I needed. Like, I needed a border that was in black, some white for the main, and then a subsequent border, and I wanted some text coloring and link coloring, stuff that's just kind of annoying to do unless you're an HTML developer, which I am most definitely not. And I just asked it to it and to spit out a CSS and the HTML, and it did it. And I basically popped it onto my file system, loaded up the browser, and it didn't do exactly what I wanted, but it did a lot of it. And the alternative in Stack Overflow land was just a bunch of gobbledygook that I had to wade through. And then I had to think. And I wanted to see, like, can I eliminate having to think in this case? And it seemed to mostly do that.
Yeah, and it's kind of nice how you can be that specific. Which brings me to my problem. I had something I was working on, some color matching. I had to match RGB pixels or pixels in an image to pixels in a patch of an image. That doesn't work so well in RGB color space. It works better in lab or CIE color space. And so I was like, but I had to do it in JavaScript. I asked it to compare histograms in CIE labs color space in JavaScript. It spit out like some little code segment, which again, just like the one that it did for Bill, it seemed plausible. In this case, I didn't actually try it. I did my own thing in the end, but I learned something about it. I learned that there's actually an OpenCV JavaScript library, and you can use OpenCV in JavaScript, which was really cool. And then it used that for color conversion, etc., because all those functions exist in OpenCV. That's the other thing that it's good for, even if you don't really, if you have you kind of know what you want to do, but you want to do it in a certain framework or environment. I think it's almost easier than Googling to ask it to solve your problem and then use at least what it spits out as an idea on how to approach the problem.
Yeah, so Carsten, I was thinking about that same thing going back to the running problem that I threw at it in Python. We three are all, I would consider, as experts in Python. But I've always heard ramblings about Julia or Rust or other languages. And with ChatGPT, you could say, okay, that's great. Now do that same problem, but write it in Julia. And that would be very instructive for me, just to see sort of the layout, knowing that I know the problem well, just to be able to see the sort of the format of that code in comparison to Python, in comparison to Rust or whatever. So learning new languages in a way with a problem that you really know that's beyond something that's hello world, I think that would be a little bit informative, even if you know, hey, I'm not going to assume that this code is right. I can see how things are formulated in that language that might be different in a language that I already know.
I think that's it. It's not necessarily right, but it's also not grossly wrong. And so you can kind of get an idea out of it.
I've almost been thinking of, like, I don't know if you guys recall this, but when ChatGPT first got released, I think it was Stack Overflow and a few of the other coding forums that had to immediately ban anyone's contributions that came from ChatGPT. I think they just actually shut down for a while because there was a bunch of script kiddies that were running off trying to answer as many Stack Overflow questions as possible. They were just blindly shoving it in ChatGPT, putting it in as an answer. And all of a sudden, these databases of responses to very particular questions that are highly curated, right? Like Stack Overflow has this voting mechanism, this reputation mechanism, like things are mostly right, like when they're in there. Obviously sometimes there's exceptions, but all of a sudden, they're getting infiltrated by folks. But it made me think that there might be a hybrid world where ChatGPT is used behind the scenes by knowledgeable humans to grow the rate at which Stack Overflow and other sites like that cover questions. But they're still the humans making sure that things are correct. In that ideal world, we get more answers and you still might be using ChatGPT, but you don't even know it.
So you're talking about exploring topic space more broadly behind the scenes with a robot, basically?
I'm talking about empowering those who crowdsource answers to Stack Overflow with ChatGPT, capabilities, right? So that they are more efficient, they can answer more questions, they still play the vital role because they're the ones whose reputation rank is on the
It defeats the purpose of Stack Overflow, though, because the thing is not really meant to be like some weird question answering thing for programming problems. It's kind of like a thing where you hope to get answers from other human individuals that either know the solution or have run into the same problem, right? The last thing I want to see on Stack Overflow is some made up answer that may or may not be correct.
So presumably they are still, because they still care about their, their rank or their credibility, they're making sure it's correct.
Yeah, but it's kind of like fake reviews on Amazon. Nobody wants them. I really could care less about somebody's rank on Stack Overflow. That digital e-pin swinging can go away. People should post an answer there because they know the answer and they want to help somebody out, not to improve their rank.
Well, but that is a philosophical difference there is worth noting. If I ask you a question and you answer it painstakingly and you give me an answer, or you immediately get an answer from ChatGPT, you look at it and you know for a fact it's correct and you save yourself 80% of the time, what's the difference from my vantage? I don't care. I got the answer from you. I still got Carsten's answer, even if it came through ChatGPT.
You didn't, because why would I sit there and answer questions using ChatGPT on Stack Overflow?
The same reason that you use ChatGPT, period, like to the stuff we were talking about, to get some boilerplate code.
If I am knowledgeable enough to make the judgment call that the answer from ChatGPT is actually correct, then I don't need ChatGPT. I could have just written my answer. And well, you could have, if I'm not knowledgeable enough, it's outright dangerous to allow that. So I don't ever want to see answers from ChatGPT on any kind of forum like that.
Have data, have a hypothesis on some high-value insights that, if extracted automatically, could transform your business. Not sure how to proceed? Bounce your ideas off one of our data scientists with a free consult. Reach out at ZIonics.com. You'll talk to an expert, not a salesperson. It's a question of efficiency, right? Like,
that's where we disagree. There's nobody sitting somewhere in the world whose job it is to answer Stack Overflow questions, right? It's not, you don't have to
well,
be
there's
efficient.
People who think it's their job. I mean,
you don't get paid because you answer 100 questions. And I hope that the people that do that with ChatGPT fall flat on their face and their reputation goes down because their answers are garbage. Anyhow,
what if they're not?
That's like Bill posting his marathon running thing. He thought it was correct. It wasn't.
But he wouldn't have posted that unless he actually verified that it was correct. Oh, I don't think.
If you say he would have validated that before he posted it, then your time savings that you're just talking about with ChatGPT are through the drain again, because you can't afford to like have it compose a thing and you spend an hour testing it and then you post it.
Maybe it's more efficient.
I looked at this completely from an efficiency perspective as well. Like, would I ever use this? Would you, and it comes down to that question, is it easier to build a house from scratch or remodel it, right? Because I think if the complexity of the code is such that there's probably something broken, it's going to take you a lot of time to go through that and validate that code. And in this case, there's no way I would have used ChatGPT to write this. I would have done it from scratch for sure. It is a bit of this toss of like, what is the most
well, so I think that's the root question, right? Are there any scenarios at all for improving efficiency amongst data scientists or developers with these tools? And I'm going to just, I found an interesting thread by Sergio Pereira on Twitter, and he listed 10 of them that I thought were kind of interesting. So one was generate boilerplate code, which we talked about, I think. Another one that he lists is research and compare. So like algorithm A versus B, or language A versus B, or framework A versus B. He talks about explaining code, like here's a blob of code, what does it do? And having it explain it in words.
That one doesn't work. That's bullshit.
I don't know. Like I tried a few of his cases and they did seem to do something generally in the ballpark.
The moment that you have code comments that just explain what you can read out of the code, just in English language,
well, agreed.
Those comments should be thrown away.
Yeah, I wasn't in love with this one either. But there's a few other ones. That one that I thought was interesting was like writing test cases, because that's something that
doesn't work.
I think they'd have to actually run an experiment against.
Well, we can do that. We can take Bill's code and run a test case, because if you get the code wrong, you get the test case wrong too.
But if the code is like a separate problem, if
just on a philosophical level, how
trying to write a test case, like because there's boilerplate code involved.
You can write boilerplate code for test cases, sure, but you cannot write the actual test case.
Well, so some of these examples were pretty specific, like check for null in this case. I felt like I would have to actually sit down and time myself on my own versus like leveraging this tool and see if I was actually faster. But my general sense is that maybe not today, but in a
Yes.
custom training of ChatGPT on code specifically around common problems and embedded in an IDE, I wouldn't be the one betting against this stuff making its way into useful IDE capabilities.
Well,
over time.
let's talk about just this issue, because I was able with ChatGPT to say thumbs up or thumbs down on that response. And I gave it a thumbs down, and I was able to explain why. We found out there was a problem with units with linear input variables. Then there was the little box that says, is this like something like unhealthy or dangerous? And I actually checked yes. And the reason why is because, guys, I have not yet run a marathon where, honestly, somebody hasn't died, somebody hasn't passed out. I've seen it all. And, you know, advice like this taken, say, with my son, for example, who doesn't know Python at all, he wouldn't necessarily know that that was right or wrong. And he could end up having, you know, a problem in the real world. That's going to have a negative impact. But what I thought about that, you know, it might be a bit dramatic here, but what I thought about that
I
is
would
that
say that
ChatGPT is now running this grand experiment where everybody and their mother is using it, and they're getting this feedback. I would love to come back in a couple of months and pose this very same problem and see if they fixed it. Basically,
I mean,
I doubt it, because how could they? It is not that there's some intelligent
I gave-
object on the other side that actually solves problems.
yeah, that's right. But
The amount of safeguards they can put in, how they can influence this particular thing, is actually very limited, right? It's kind of like,
yeah, it's not like you can correct scenarios 17 and 18 and 29.
Well,
I mean,
actually, on top of these large language models, you have human annotation, right? That gives basically corrects the output, and that's where you might have a chance.
But then
So
we're
I
back
am
to
curious.
our original
Yeah.
topic of AI and machine learning, right? How do you correct this? Well, great, you gather new data and try to train it on that data, and then you pray. You know, there are no guarantees. So that's where it gets difficult to correct any of these issues, or to guarantee anything that comes out of it.
I want to go back to a moment and say and ask the question, like, how is it that a model that's trained to predict future sequences of characters and words can get to the point where we can even have this conversation? Like, how can it even get to the point of producing, albeit wrong, but totally like passable code that a lot of people disagree with and genuinely are using this stuff daily in their coding practices? You know, like a simple use case is like, apparently it's quite accurate at generating regexes. I hate generating regexes, and everyone's regex builder that's ever been out on the web's annoying to use.
Boy, you just landed on a problem that I would use Chat. I would just try it.
So
I would, because it takes.
But my question though is like, how is it that this stuff can, given that it doesn't know what it's talking about, how is it that it can appear so much like it knows what it's talking about?
Because it's like everything, it's pattern recognition and pattern assembly. It's literally based on statistical distributions of patterns in the corpus that it has seen and learned. And it learns what goes together and what is more likely to go together and what does not go together. And then you throw attention in the mix, and it knows exactly each output element, what input elements to focus on, which are most relevant. And it produces good results. I'm not sure if anybody in the world can explain to you why it exactly is capable of doing what it's doing. But ultimately, it's just based on patterns and statistical pattern distributions in its training corpus.
When you take code output that looks very reasonable, given that it's predicting sort of one token or a snippet of a word, in this case, at a time, and it comes up with something that's actually quite reasonable. It's wrong, but it's reasonable. It is a little bit mind-blowing, actually.
You hit the nail on the head. It's wrong, but it's reasonable. And it gets the reasonable because of its patterns. And it's wrong because there is no exact match to what you wanted out there. And so it just came up with something that looks reasonable. And it does that in many, many cases. That's why it makes up facts in language. It makes facts up when you ask it about a person or something. And it makes shit up when it writes code.
I find it mind-boggling that the same piece of software that, you know, predicts a handful of words, you know, or whatever in front of where it's at, that's basically how this thing's trained, at least the large language model part, not the reinforcement learning part. I find it mind-boggling that you can somehow get to that, and the same thing can translate from French to German to like Klingon. The same thing that can translate from Python to JavaScript to, you know, I mean, the same thing can reason about like such a massive array of stuff. Like I just can't.
Here's a funny thought. I agree with you. I find it mind-boggling as well. I don't understand exactly how it works. I mean, and we're actually at the point where it's a little bit like the human brain. We kind of know mechanically how it works, right? There's synapses and neurons, and we kind of know the molecular composition of the human brain. What we do not understand is how it is actually capable of doing what it's doing. I think we have reached a certain point in our modeling of the human brain where we're at the same point. I can explain to the mechanical details of how it's implemented, what it does on a pure physical level. How that in particular leads to the output we're seeing, I have no freaking clue. No idea.
But isn't that sort of the miracle of this thing in a way? I mean, if we talk about miracles, we talk about mysteries of the mind. I feel like there's a huge mystery around the synthetic minds that are being created. We don't really know. These are very large, complicated neural nets.
Exactly.
Their own creators don't know. We just can't know.
And the only other thing I can think of that is the human brain.
Yeah. And a lot of these models that we're looking at here, they're biologically inspired or behaviorally inspired, right? Like the reinforcement learning models are all based on this reward system, basically. And you can think about when you're a kiddo and you do a bunch of stupid stuff, you're rewarded or punished for a lot of your decisions, and you learn quite quickly.
That was the goal when we set out 100 years ago. Why this whole research went into that direction. We wanted to understand human thinking and learning and intelligence. Yeah. I think with this and with this magnitude and size, we have come one step closer. There is a danger in getting it to work, but not understanding why it works.
Well, if the black box was ever black, it's certainly when you have a model that has 178 billion parameters.
But it's not black. I can tell you exactly what's in there, but I don't know why it's working the way it's working.
In the overall sense, right?
Yeah. So going back to the theme of this discussion, which is, hey, can we use ChatGPT-like functionality to help build machine learning and AI systems in addition to coding in general? The question I would ask is okay, so maybe ChatGPT falls down because it's trained so generally. But if you were starting up a startup that's, let's say, laser focused on just machine learning assistance tooling, how would you train differently? How would you reformulate the problem? How can you start to address some of these limitations that we're seeing around blatantly, very confidently saying things that are wrong but appear quite right and get you started?
I don't think you can. I don't think you can fix that problem. That's where we're at. What we said earlier, right? We have this very mechanical implemented large language model trained on a massive amount of data. We don't really know why it puts out what it puts out. So we can't actually fix that. And I mean, ChatGPT is the next evolution of trying to fix it with reinforcement learning, right? It's kind of like GPT-3 plus reinforcement learning or some other magic. So we're trying to fix it by fine-tuning it towards the right direction based on how it interacts with the world. Can we actually fix it with a guaranteed fix? No,
not with
I don't
a guarantee, so. But can we just improve efficacy?
Well, yeah, and we're going to do that. But I think what really needs to change is the way that people approach it and that people approach the output. There is a way to approach it that is dangerous, which is taking the output and believing it's true. And there is a way, there's many, many good ways to use it. And we mentioned some of them today, right? Inspiration, examples. Let's say you know what you want to do, but you don't know how to implement it. What is an efficient implementation of X? Just ask ChatGPT, it gives you an implementation. If you know the problem and how to validate its correctness, then use that code and see if it makes sense to you, right? Get some inspiration from it. Just don't use it blindly. That's
I'm thinking more of on the training side, can we modify our training somehow to intentionally teach things that are correct and that are incorrect so that it understands the difference?
That's what we're doing, right? That's how ChatGPT is training with the reinforcement learning. It's basically being delivered a question, a set of answers, and it has to basically and a set of answers that are ranked in correctness. So,
well, I guess I wonder about the human feedback that's being given. You really need people to actually when it comes to code, it's not enough to say yeah, I speak French, I speak English, that translation was correct. I have to actually take this piece of code and run it and see if this was right or wrong or some gradation in between. How do you formulate a problem so that we actually can take steps forward to correct things when they're wrong?
I don't think you do, because I don't think that ChatGPT or any technology based on a large language model will ever be able to actually solve problems. The only thing it does is it literally just can reassemble patterns it's seen in the past. So you will never be able to ask it for something new. It doesn't think, it doesn't reason.
Well,
So
but I
the only
already ask
thing,
it for things new, and it seems to do a reasonable job.
no, you can only ask it for things that are recombinations of things already in existence.
I mean,
Yeah, but
given
that's
that
a
it's
lot of
taken
stuff.
given that it's taken the world's worth of text information and ingested it in training the model, you're very likely to see things that you might construe to be new, but it's not new to it. Right?
Agreed.
Yeah.
You're listening to your AI Injection, brought to you by ZIonics.com. That's XYONIX.com. Check out our website for more content, or if you need help injecting AI into your organization.
That's kind of what I'm asking is like, if I'm a startup and I'm trying to make the world's best IDE that leverages as much AI as possible, what am I going to do differently than what the OpenAI folks have done with ChatGPT?
Yeah, I'm a little bit in Carsten's camp right now in that I don't see its value in this form quite yet, given that I don't necessarily trust it, and given how it does business in producing its completions. I don't have a solid
Yeah, but
answer
do you
to that.
trust AutoSuggest to like method names? I mean,
Yeah,
you
because
do.
it auto suggests the method name, and then I have the
You
documentation next to the method name, and I know exactly if it's the method I want
Yeah,
or
but
not.
the reason you trust it is because you can look at it on the fly and agree with whatever it's done.
That's right.
But in the case of code that's more elaborate, you know it takes energy and effort to go in and look. The question could be, in terms of like, how do we apply this stuff, is like, maybe there's a compartmentalization. Like we went from something as straightforward as like method name autosuggest all the way up to boom, like a whole huge block of code. But maybe there's like a spectrum in between.
Personally, I don't think we do, and I don't think we should. I do not think that like writing code is something that should be automated by weird AI things, because I think writing code is ultimately like a very creative process. It's a very individual process for the programmer. It's not like somebody shoveling sand. I mean, sometimes you're shoveling sand, but most of the time it's creative. And ultimately, you're trying to solve new problems in a new way. And even if it's an old problem, you might actually improve on other solutions that are out there. If all we do is like start regurgitating things that an AI suggests to us, we will essentially halt progress.
Well, I mean, I would agree that the kind of code you write satisfies your description, but I would not agree that somebody who works at a firm that's got 193 drivers for a particular whatever printer and now is making the 194th driver, that it's a particularly creative pursuit, or that it can't be, accelerated and automated somehow, leveraging some of this capabilities.
If that driver is the same as a driver already in existence, by all means, ask ChatGPT how to talk to it or how to write it. If that driver is something your company just innovated on, is a new product that gets out on the market, and you want to write a good driver for it, then by all means do not use it.
Well, I think the point that I'm trying to make is there's a ton of problems that are not creative, that are lame and boring. And they've been done a bajillion times. It's just they've been done a bajillion times by somebody else. And I think
ultimately there's also a whole movement that goes toward these, what is it, like code-free application development. Mm-hmm. Right, where you enable people that can't code at all to do like some visual programming, or just slide little building blocks around. And I feel like using AI or ChatGPT for code generation is kind of like the equivalent to that for people that can partially code or are lazy. Yes, use it if you have to do something really, really boring. Sure. I mean, I might even do that, right? If I have to write HTML and CSS, by all means, absolutely.
Wait, taking one step forward towards something that's a bit more data sciencing, machine learning stuff.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever used ChatGPT? I have actually tested it, not just for this exercise, but how do I write efficiently in pandas, multiple aggregations in a group by clause, and have it put out something. And that actually changes depending on the version of pandas you're using, which we know. But I personally found its answers to a lot of those questions to maybe be correct, actually, but very inefficient. And so again, I was left with this kind of thought, well, even if it's correct, I have to check that it's correct. And ultimately, that's not as sufficient as if I were to do it on my own, because I know a better way. Well, I just wonder for like people who are exploring territory that don't know how to put together a deep learning network or something, so, like, would they use something like this in a way? I mean,
that brings up a good point.
Like write me some Keras code to do like convolutional.
And the way I see it is like when you're really learning something from scratch, and let's say you're on the more novice side and you're trying to do something new, you, you spend a lot of time Googling, you're trying to find just the right, like oftentimes you're trying to find just the right boilerplate or the right seed code to get started. And it doesn't quite fit. And then you go and you compile or you run your test case or whatever, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but usually it doesn't. That process can be time consuming and tedious, and you could get into the ballpark a lot closer. And I did some experimenting where I just said, hey, generate me with the scikit-learn classifier for the flower petal problem, like just generate that boilerplate code. And it did it pretty quickly. So then I thought like, okay, well that, otherwise I got to go around until I find that one particular example that's sitting out on their website. I feel like there exists a world where somebody hasn't written exactly what you're trying to do, but they've got posts that are sort of spread out across 4, 5, 10 different places. And this stuff plays a role. Like it gets me a template right off the bat.
It's what we talked about earlier, and actually that's what I found when I had to write this color matching histogram code in JavaScript. Does that exist? I Googled actually for it, and it doesn't. I wouldn't find anything in Google. Then I asked OpenGPT to write it for me, and I was like, that looks a way like I could do that in JavaScript. And JavaScript is something I don't develop often in, so while I kind of know the language, the syntactic details elude me sometimes. It was really good to have that sample code to then implement literally line by line myself, validate that it's correct as I'm doing so, and say, okay, that makes sense. But now I had like an example that I could go for, like a template, right? So I do think it's good for that. I do not think, and that accelerates things, right? If I had to dig that out myself, I might have like ran it with like 10 more errors. So that accelerates development, but can I really use it to like dramatically accelerate my development and have it actually help me with problems I don't quite understand? No, the answer is definitely no for me. It is good for things that I already know, that I can validate myself. And I'm just looking for templates because, last time I did this was 3 years ago and I've forgotten how the hell it works.
So would both of you guys agree that, would you encourage folks to experiment and try this stuff and play around and come up with their own ideas on when to use it and when not? Or do you think they can wait 6 months, it doesn't matter?
Let me take the example of my son who doesn't know how to program in Python. He's just starting off in school and he's going to at some point. I think I would totally encourage him to say, look, here's a problem that you asked me. I told you I had written code for it to solve it some time ago. Why don't you just go off and do that yourself and see and have it generate the code? You can learn something from that. I think for beginners and folks looking for just a structure, maybe a little bit lazy.
I agree. I think it's a great learning tool because when you learn something, it always helps to get many different perspectives on it. And I think that ChatGPT can really help you take a problem and get many different perspectives on it, how to implement it, change some parameters, how would you implement it now, etc., etc. So you can see the different variations. And it gets it correctly close enough that even if there's a calculation error in there, it doesn't really matter, right? We're not asking it to write the temperature control for the nuclear reactor. We just want some like
and we're not going to hit deploy automatically.
Funny colors on a Java page. So I think it's actually great for that, and I would even use it for that, right? If I'm trying to get into a new API, a new system, say I want to do something in React, I have no freaking clue about React, right? Hey, how do I create a button in React? Great, give me some template code. I think I would totally use it for that. Templates, examples, learning experience, and then transfer that into my own application.
Let's do this. Jump out. I know this is going to be a very hard question to answer, but sometimes these ones are fun. Jump out 10 years into the future, right? Like all three of us here can look back 10 years and 10 years before that, and unfortunately 10 years before that, and we can see the big jumps that happened, right? So jump out 10 years in the future. How is AI and machine learning code being written, if at all? And how is software being written? And how is it different by all of this new stuff that's like emerging at such a rapid pace?
Well, first of all, I think that we're going to be entering a new paradigm centered around the questions that we're talking about in terms of correctness. Carsten stated earlier that we could take these large language model approach. You're evolving completions that come from, statistics and patterns that are matched against the world's worth of data in text. Somewhere there has to be a change in that modeling paradigm that they're trying to introduce now, which is, well, you can go ahead and spit something out that's really interesting in terms of its patterns, but it's not correct. How do you change the system so that what you're spitting out is actually usable and correct from the get-go? Like I say, I think 6 months from now, I would love to see, for example, a ChatGPT which is comprised of a set of models, but now not based on GPT-3, but GPT-4, which is, if you listen to the rumor mill, is headed towards the direction of trying to create these corrections logically, philosophically, etc. So in the future, probably in a couple of years even, I'm hoping that we can get to address these kind of programming challenges, and we start to trust these a lot more. That kind of changes to me. Once you develop a certain level of trust in something, you can start implementing these, machine learning models in your toaster and in your aids. I wouldn't want to ever see it in a nuclear reactor, honestly, but there's going to be levels of trust that I think that we can develop as a society in using these tools, depending on how accurate they're seen to be.
Carsten?
It's a good question. I don't really know.
Would you ever trust a robot to do surgery on you, Carsten?
Me, for sure.
Without human supervision? No, I don't think so.
But based on a lot of supervision,
Depends on the
given to
surgery.
the models.
I don't trust a Tesla to drive me either. No, I would not. Because even if you get a 99.9% accuracy rate, there's still 0.1% that you end up dead or against a bridge pillar. So no, you don't get guarantees with that. These are not like validatable systems. 10 years from now, I think we see further growth because we have just experienced that, as it has been, the more data we throw at these things, the more closer we come to better performance. Because I feel like we're really getting closer to how the human brain works, which has still a couple billion more parameters than this. So I think we'll see these models get bigger and bigger and bigger and possibly more powerful. What's lacking is that step that you mentioned, Bill, the validation, and how can we actually validate accuracy? I don't really know what the answer to that is because we can't control the model. If we can't control the model, maybe we can throw the garbage results away. If we do that, we would need some sort of validation, right? So can I somehow get the model to produce it and then have an automated step that validates whether or not it's good? And if it's not good, then just produce something new. That is also the paradigm of reinforcement learning, right? It's kind of like you do something, you take an action, and then you get a response, good or bad, and then we refine your things. So if we could come up with an automatic validation for what we're building, we could actually use reinforcement learning to fine-tune these things.
That's where I was thinking is like, can we, if we tell the system, generate some code that does X, now let's run that code somewhere, and then let's define what X is in a crisp way so that we can actually test it. And if that's right, what gets generated gets reinforced positively. If it's wrong, it gets reinforced.
So maybe we accomplish
that. If we accomplish that, then we're headed in a really interesting direction.
So maybe we see kind of like a mix of these models with like a new edition of the expert systems from the 70s that had big rule bases and knowledge bases that would validate things, right? Somebody claims that, Bill Clinton, and it goes a little bit to like reference and attribution and text that GPT writes, right? Right now, there is no such thing. But if we could have a fact checker, right, that says, Bill Clinton was president. And GPT writes something about President Bill Clinton, and this thing would say, take that fact and check it against the database, or have some validation step. I think that would give the whole thing a little bit more trust, a little bit more believability.
I think one analogy I can go back into history and think about is I had an adaptive signal processing class back in, I think in grad school, and somebody for fun, I can't remember what we were building. It was some particular filter or something. Somebody for fun implemented it in assembly.
For fun?
This is the kind of thing that happened.
Right.
So they and for those listeners of ours who don't know what assembly code is, it's like really tedious level code. And to do something simple can take, hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of lines of code to do stuff. And then somebody else, in another class had implemented stuff in like native C, somebody else in C++, somebody else in like Java-like languages. Because, sometimes, students get bored and they want to do something more challenging. But ultimately, we got to the point, this is back in the early 90s where, in MATLAB, whatever you were studying in a textbook or reading in a paper, you could kind of express almost line for line the mathematical expressions. You could express them in a very compact way in a language like MATLAB or R or something. And I feel like that whatever level you think at, if we get to the compact expression of that, then the conversation is no longer about programming, right? Like if you're taking an optimal control theory class in graduate school, like nobody really talks about the code part. Like you're just talking in math and you're communicating back and forth with the mathematical symbols. Machine learning AI systems, at some point, I'm asking the question, is there like an analogy there where normal programming is just like a lot of verbosity? It's like a whole bunch of stuff, but at some level, if you think, in Star Trek, you're interacting with the computer on Star Trek, it's really like, what can you express? What can you get an answer? Is that the end place that we wind up in 10 years or
Yeah, of
50
course.
or 100?
I think that's something we see quite naturally in all software development, and you can see it in machine learning today, right? Look at something like Keras, right? Which is a library on top of TensorFlow. And you could just say, hey, the TensorFlow implementation of this neural network, that's your programming. That thing that you do in Keras, where you have like 10 lines that just describe a couple of layers in a network, these are your building blocks. That's almost visual programming.
That's thinking at that
on that
point.
high level. And I think we'll just like continue with that. Tomorrow, we will basically, the whole thing that today is in Keras will become a new building block. And I mean, modern neural networks are like built like that. If you read a paper, you see like there's a block here, right? It's just like, this is the attention block. But the problem is this block has like 300 subblocks, and the subblocks have subblocks. So in order to go back to the actual implementation where you're multiplying a couple of matrices, you're already 100 miles away from ground zero. So yeah, things will become more abstract, more compositional. We'll have validated building blocks that we put together to like solve problems. It's kind of like that today already. I think it just continues.
I feel like that was a great summary of the 10 years out, like that you just had there. I think that's it. It's like these systems are going to continue to get more and more and more and more powerful, but at some point a human is communicating with another human, then we will converge at the minimal amount of effort it takes to communicate whatever they need to communicate.
That's right.
In the old days, that might have been a 1,000-page thesis, but in the future, it might be a prompt your AI system with this and answer it like this, and boom, there you go.
So in that line, I have an interesting thought. You guys familiar with the whole cyberpunk literature genre?
Yeah, a little bit.
William Gibson,
like Neil Stephenson and those guys.
Yeah, exactly. A bunch of years in the future, especially in William Gibson's world, the big tech companies and corporations rule the world, right?
Yeah.
These models, they're getting so big and so expensive that they're not going to be democratized anymore. I mean, look at what's going on right now. You have OpenAI. Microsoft put a 10 billion bid in for OpenAI.
Oh, yeah. I mean, any day now we're going to be paying.
They're going to be implementing that on Microsoft Azure. And then everybody that wants to use one of these nice, great new models has to go to one of the big corporations with their big AI and use their output. And you can only hope and pray that, it's really the raw output of this thing, that your data is not being abused, stored, used for other nefarious purposes. We are beyond the stage where you can run this and say, well, I like this. I'll just download this model. I run it in isolation on my home system. And I think there's a big danger in that, but that's probably a topic for a whole different podcast.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a fun conversation. Thanks, guys, for coming on, and
that was fun.
And we'll see what happens. I don't know, but in the meantime, to all of our listeners, if you haven't by now been playing with ChatGPT, obviously you should. If you write code or write machine learning code, dink around, drop us a note on Twitter or wherever about some useful things that you find, or spectacularly useless things. So, all right. Thanks, everybody.
That's all for this episode. I'm Deep Dylan, your host, saying check back soon for your next AI injection. In the meantime, if you need help injecting AI into your business, reach out to us at ZIonics.com. That's XYONIX.com. Whether it's text, audio, video, or other business data, we help all kinds of organizations like yours automatically find and operationalize transformative insights.